In this video, I'm going to show you a very quick tour of all of the audio effects that come bundled with Ableton Live version 10 full suite. Now there are 39 of these audio effects, so when I say quick, the video may end up being quite long, but I'm not going to go in depth into each plugin. I'm just going to show you a very brief overview, and I have arranged these into some categories that might help you sort of wrap your head around the wide diversity of effects and processing available. Let's dive right in. So here I have a track with a number of EQ-based plugins. I have Channel EQ, EQ3, EQ8, and Auto Filter. And each one does something slightly different. And you may be familiar with some of these effects already because we've been using them throughout the course. When that happens to be the case, I'm not going to belabor them. But here is a drum beat, and we're going to see how these plugins affect the sound of the drum beat. That one's pretty self-explanatory, as are most of the EQs. Here you can boost the low, mids, or highs. You can adjust the center frequency, and there's an overall output knob. EQ3 is actually very similar. It just has a different algorithm, and it has the added benefit that you can cut a band by pressing a button here. So let's check that out. So both of these EQs are useful for like performance activities when you want to control like the tone or the EQ of a track in real time. EQ8 is more for the production side of Ableton. You can use it for performance, but there's a lot more to it, and so it's ideal for production. I'm not going to demonstrate EQ8 except to say that it does have this wonderful graph as does the channel EQ. Now, Auto Filter is a plugin we talked about earlier in the course, and I just want to remind you that you can set the low frequency here and then crank this envelope knob up, and it will be responsive to the sound envelope. And if we listen to this with a different kind of loop, say a guitar loop, it has, a different flavor. And so you could automate this. This is a very common sound, the filter sweep automation. All right. So if you have been engaged in this course at all, you are probably pretty familiar with these EQ plugins. We're going to move on to compression. And same thing here. We've used compressor and glue compressor pretty extensively, and the limiter. In one of the previous modules, I went into greater detail on multiband dynamics and drum bus. So these are just some of the standard compressors that you will find in every DAW. But I do want to remind you that these have sidechain functions if they have the little triangle there. And so you can sidechain the compressor, glue compressor, and multiband dynamics. The gate. We haven't really talked about gate, so let's check that out. So a gate will open and close the sound or allow sound to come through if it's above a certain volume threshold. It's sort of like, in a way, the opposite of a compressor, in that if the sound drops below the threshold, it will cut it off completely. It's sort of like a more extreme version of an expander. And let's check it out on the drums here. I can also flip this to invert the relationship between the threshold and the material. So gates are useful for creating special effects on beats and loops. You can also use it in the studio when you are processing vocals and you want to cut out all of the chatter that you might hear, like the little mouth sounds and things, but you don't have the time to go through and edit it out properly. You could use a gate and set it very carefully and eliminate most mouth noises. And then when the singer or speaker or rapper or whoever comes in with their main part, it should be able to be heard. So this is how I think of these. EQ, these sort of 4 plugins right here, and compression, these plugins right here. If we move on to reverb and delay, again, we have some familiar plugins that I don't really need to go over because we've been using them throughout the course. And if you've taken the level 1 course, you've seen similar plugins in Pro Tools, like Air Reverb or Deverb or something like that. But here we do have a reverb plugin. We have a delay plugin, and you can set the delays to be linked left and right or unlinked. You can set them to be tempo synced or time based. And there's a filter, and a lot of these plugins have filters. You'll see that all over the place. One we really haven't talked about too much, and that's my favorite time-based effect, echo. Echo gives you the ability to set independent left and right or to link them, sync-based or time-based delays, and then, you know, all the usual controls, but it's got this great sort of tunnel interface, and you can switch it between stereo, ping pong, or mid-side, and it gives you a wealth of different effects with the touch of a button. You can also add reverb, and there are a lot of modulation parameters, and this character tab that controls some of the dynamics and this wobble, which is kind of neat. But I'm just going to play this loop right here, and we'll hear how echo affects it. You can also use this with very short delays for timbral effects. Here are some very short delays with high feedback. It's a completely different sound. Okay, next, a couple of delays we haven't talked about this semester, and this is filter delay. What filter delay does is it gives you a delay line on your left, a delay line on your right, and a combined delay line left and right. You can turn them on and off by clicking on their buttons. And then each one also has a filter that you can enable and set independently. There are different delay times, of course, feedback controls, panning. This is sort of like a filtered multi-tap delay almost. And you can really control the character of each of those taps with the filter and time controls here, as well as the pan, feedback, and volume controls. Now, the most complicated delay plugin is this grain delay. Basically, you have this graph, and there are parameters running along the bottom and the side, and they are the same. So what you can do is at any given time, you can have a graph of 2 of these parameters, for instance, spray and pitch. And then you can see the values in these boxes so that when I move this, you can see I'm moving pitch along the x-axis and spray along the y-axis. However, if I wanted to switch that, I could do that. And now pitch is moving along the y and spray is moving along the x. So at any given point, you can have 2 parameters changing or being controlled simultaneously. You do have to be careful with this plugin because a little bit goes a long way. You can get a lot of really weird special effects. I'm not sure it's quite appropriate for guitar, but you could try a bunch of different things. And grain delay, you could spend a lot of time with and have fun. All right, we're going to move on now to the next track, chorus, flanger, and phaser. These are three classic effects that are thought of often in a group together because they are time and phase based. And so each one of these uses like multiple delay lines inside of it to adjust and manipulate the timing and phase of the audio. Let's check it out. Here is the guitar loop, and then I'm going to add these effects one at a time. So it's got that kind of thicker sound, and you can do a lot with this. You could make it really extreme and ugly, or you could make it just kind of subtle to thicken things up just a bit. And flanger, similar, except it has modulation ongoing, so it has this kind of swirling sound. If you were like an 80s, 90s baby like me, you recognize that sound in like every song. A lot of guitar players were fond of flangers back then. And then finally we have the phaser, and it has a similar sound but with a different principle. And of course, a lot of these plugins, just like Phaser, have LFO controls, envelope controls, to give you additional creative possibilities. Moving on, we have a track with some effects that are clearly originally designed for guitars, but they really could be used on anything. I'm going to demonstrate them on a guitar loop here. And first of all, we have a tuner, which I'm not going to demonstrate because I don't have a guitar plugged into my system here. But this is just a utility. If you have a guitar live on stage or in your studio, you can tune it right with Ableton Live. We do have an amp simulator, a cabinet simulator, and a pedal simulator. So let's check those out. So you have a variety of different models of amp here, some EQ controls, and a presence, which is like a tone control. The cabinet is similar. It still amplifies the signal, and you have a choice of 1x12, 2x12, and if you're not familiar with guitar amps and cabinets, this would be like the number of speakers and how big they are. So a 4x10 would be 4 individual speakers in the cabinet, and they're each 10 inches. You can also select a microphone placement, either on axis, off axis, or far away. And those are some very common positions that you would mic a guitar cabinet in the studio. You can switch the mic type and the mono or stereo output. And finally here we have the pedal control, which gives you overdrive, distortion, and fuzz with these buttons. Tone controls here, EQ, gain and output for the incoming signal and outgoing signal. And let's check this out, overdrive. Here's distortion and fuzz. So these are just different algorithms for different kinds of distortion. You could also use these in combination, and if you move their order around, you will get different sounds because the signal flow in Ableton goes from left to right in the channel strip down here. That is an advantage over real world equipment that you can't always put it in whatever order you want. So check out the guitar effects, especially if you're a guitar player. Moving on, I have a track with a lot of other distortion plugins. The Dynamic Tube plugin is designed to emulate tube saturation, and there are 3 types of tubes to choose from of varying quality. There are also drive, tone, and bias knobs that affect the amount of distortion and saturation generated by this plugin. So let's check it out. First, I'm going to play this clip without the plugin, and then I'm going to add the plugin. So it just adds a bit of distortion, a bit of character. It's not like a huge effect on this particular clip. If you added it to a bass or a guitar, it'll obviously respond differently. But we're going to move on for now to Erosion, which is another distortion plugin that adds noise or a sine wave into the signal and bases the distortion on that. Next, we have this Overdrive plugin, and Overdrive is adding different frequency harmonics to the spectrum. And so here we go. So again, it gives it a bite. This is another very common effect for guitars, but in the guitar effects, there is overdrive built in to some of these other plugins. So moving on, we have the Saturator, which again is a plugin that adds distortion by manipulating the harmonics or the overtones of the frequencies in the signal. And there are a variety of curves you can choose from, including the analog clip, medium curve, sinoid fold, etc. Next, we have this very interesting plugin. It's not exactly a distortion plugin, but it does produce a distorted sound, so I included it in this track. This is called Redux, and what it does is it simulates bit crushing or bit reduction and downsampling. Let's check it out. And then here's the downsampling feature. So this can give you like an old school video game sound if you use it correctly. The last plugin in this track is the Vinyl Distortion. This plugin is interesting because it will start making sound like basically as soon as you turn it on, and even when your session's not playing. So frequently on forums and stuff, people will be asking this question, like, I hear this noise in my export or in my session. I don't know where it's coming from. And often it's this plugin that they have put in their session, forgotten about, don't realize that it's turned on all the time. And so that's the source, but here it is. And if you're sharp, you can hear that crackling already. Of course, you can see the meter going. And this is designed to emulate the sound of vinyl distortion that would be found in like records. So I can turn this up. And then of course it'll affect the clip as well. And again, when I stop the clip, you can still hear the crackle. So there are a variety of distortion plugins, and of course other plugins that are not included in this track also have the ability to provide distortion, but this is a way producers often use to add character to their sounds. Moving on here, we have a track I call Moving Effects. And so we have 3 plugins in this: Auto Pan, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, this sort of back and forth, left and right panning effect here. And you can adjust the amount and the rate of the panning, the phase and the shape of it, whether it's more sloped or more sudden, as well as the shape of the actual modulating wave here. All right, Beat Repeat is one of my favorite plugins. I did a much longer tutorial of this on my Fort Hayes Audio Production YouTube channel. You can check it out if that's where you're watching this video. And what this does is this simply repeats a beat. You can change the chance that that repeat will happen between 0 and 100%. You can adjust the interval of the repetition from 1 bar all the way down to a 30-second note. You can offset it by anywhere in the bar. And so if you don't want beat 1 to repeat, you want beat 2 to repeat, you can offset it by a beat. There are a whole lot of other parameters that I'm not going to go into in this video. Just know that this is a pretty great plugin for creativity. It also has this great pitch decay function. And that's just kind of neat. And then last but not least in this track, we have Looper, which is really not designed to be set up the way I'm demonstrating these effects right now. It's really designed to be used live. You could loop your voice or a guitar or something else. But just to show you how it works, it's pretty simple, pretty intuitive. You hit record, you hit play, and now it's generated this loop. If I stop this, you can see that the looper has captured a portion of the clip and is looping it. And then you could add loops to that. But like I said, it's not ideal to demonstrate in a video. Ideally, you would use this live. Over here, we have a track that I'm calling Creative Effects, and this has a few different kind of various effects. We've got Corpus, Resonators, Frequency Shifter, and the Vocoder. And I have this conga loop here, and I'm going to demonstrate these plugins one at a time. Here's what the conga loop sounds like with no effect. And now Corpus is very similar to Collision. And I did a much longer tutorial video on Collision earlier in the course, and you can revisit that. But Corpus is basically Collision in audio effect form. So you can choose the thing that will be hit, whether that's a beam, a marimba bar, a string, and so on. And then you have all the same parameters that you have in Collision. So I'm not going to go over those. You can go back and watch the Collision video if you want to know more about it. But basically, these notes are now hitting a virtual object. All right, moving on here, we have Resonators. What Resonators does is it sort of imposes tonal information on whatever is running through it. In this case, we have this conga loop, which has pitch, but not like musical pitch the same way, like a keyboard does. But here, I'm setting the first resonator to the note C3, and then resonators 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'm setting to different pitches above that root. So this is +5, which is a perfect 4th above the root, and then we have a perfect 5th above the root, a minor 7th above the root, and then we have an octave and a minor 3rd above the root. And so if I play this, you'll hear this pitched information. And of course, each one of these, you can change the pitch, you can change the fine tuning, the volume level, you can turn them on and off. If you want to know more about resonators, I suggest you just experiment with it and read the Ableton manual. Moving on here, we have the frequency shifter. Now, the frequency shifter adds a certain number of hertz to whatever frequency is coming through it. So if I go back to this conga loop, I can raise the pitch of that by adding hertz. It's not exactly like transposing the clip, it's a different sort of sound. And I can also subtract frequency there. If I switch this to ring mode, now we have ring modulation, which adds and subtracts frequencies at the same time. And so that's kind of an interesting effect. Last on this track, we have the classic vocoder. This is a little complicated to set up. We really haven't done a lesson on vocoder. But basically what's going on here is I have my carrier set to external, and I'm getting audio from this sort of hidden operator track here. On the operator track, I have one oscillator active, and I have switched the wave from the default sine wave to saw D. And now I can play this like an instrument if I turn the track on. That's what it sounds like. But I'm actually going to mute that track because I don't need to hear this track to do what I want to do. I'm going to go back to this vocal here, and here's what it sounds like with no effects. Yeah! And I'm going to turn the vocoder on. I have the pitch sort of vocoding information coming from that operator. Now you won't hear anything because I'm not pressing any keys down, and that's where it's getting its information from. But as soon as I press keys down, and so whatever keys I press on that operator synthesizer, it superimposes those pitches over the material. If you want to know more about vocoders, again, check out the Ableton Live manual. I know I've been saying that a lot. It really is worthwhile. And then in this track, I'm calling utilities. I just have two plugins, the Spectrum utility and the utility plugin. Spectrum shows you a frequency graph of whatever you're playing, and you can adjust the resolution with this setting. It's sort of like EQ8 without the controls. It's purely for analysis. And then I have this utility plugin. And what this does is it allows you to make a track or sound wider or narrower with this mono control. If mono is off, you still have the option to have only the bass frequencies come out as mono. And that's pretty useful sometimes when you're using like a drum kit, if you want to spread the sound of the cymbals and the snare and stuff out, but keep that kick in the middle and it's like all in one loop. This is pretty handy. There are also gain and balance controls. One pro tip here, since automation sort of hijacks control of your fader, what a lot of producers will do is put a utility plug-in on every track, and then if you want to do volume automation, you will automate this gain knob on the utility instead of the fader. And so I've done that a few times. It's very handy. Here's what this sounds like. And you can do other things like flip the phase of the left or right channel, swap them, things like that. The only thing to be careful about here is excessive phase shift that might weaken your sound. And finally, we have the external audio effect and the audio effect rack, which are not exactly effects themselves, but I did want to just show them. This is the plugin you would use if you had outboard gear that you wanted to bring into Ableton and use that effect. You could just route it from here. And of course, the effect rack is where you could put multiple effects into one container and have multiple chains of effects. So that's how you would achieve that with the audio effect rack. You can just drag the effects in. In the next video, we're going to cover MIDI effects.